In the high-altitude killing fields above Nazi-occupied Europe, German fighter pilots discovered a terrifying new reality in the winter of 1943. The Americans had solved what should have been an insurmountable physics problem. The dreaded twin-boomed P-38 Lightning, once vulnerable during high-speed dives, was now performing maneuvers that defied the understood limits of aerodynamics. German aces, who had relied on a simple defensive tactic, diving away from the heavy American fighter, suddenly found themselves being followed through vertical plunges that should have been impossible before being mercilessly hunted down and destroyed. A small, seemingly insignificant piece of metal, the dive recovery flap, had changed the course of the air war. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The transformation of the P-38 from a flawed fighter into one of the most feared weapons in the European theater represents one of the most dramatic mid-war technical evolutions of World War II. In the frigid air above 20,000 feet, where the war for air supremacy was decided, the Lightning had initially been a disappointment. Despite its impressive speed, firepower, and range on paper, early combat reports told a different story. German pilots quickly discovered that when confronted by the P-38, all they needed to do was roll over and dive steeply away. The massive American fighter would attempt to follow but soon enter a deadly compressibility lockup, its controls freezing as it approached the sound barrier, often resulting in structural failure and the death of the pilot. This aerodynamic phenomenon, known as compressibility, was poorly understood in the early 1940s. As aircraft approached speeds of around 0.7 Mach, 70% the speed of sound, shock waves would form on the wings, drastically altering airflow and rendering control surfaces ineffective. For the P-38, with its unique twin-boom design and thick wing profile, this limitation was particularly severe. The faster the dive, the worse the problem became. The control stick would become immovable, leaving pilots helpless as their aircraft either continued in an unrecoverable dive or began a violent tumble that tore the airframe apart. By late 1942, Luftwaffe pilots had standardized their defensive tactics against the Lightning. Hans-Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa, who shot down 158 Allied aircraft before his death in September 1942, reportedly told his squadron mates, "When you see the twin-tailed devil, don't try to outrun it. Dive away sharply, they cannot follow." This simple defensive maneuver had proven devastatingly effective. Major Hans Assi Hahn, commanding officer of 13-2, noted in his combat report from November 1942, "The American P-38s we encountered today attempted to engage our formation at 7,000 meters. When we executed our diving defense, not a single one could follow. We destroyed 3 when they attempted to pursue." For the 8th Air Force, the situation was becoming critical. The P-38 had been counted on to provide long-range escort for American bomber formations penetrating deep into Germany. Its twin engines offered a margin of safety over enemy territory that single-engine fighters couldn't match, and its concentrated nose armament, 120mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns, made it a potent bomber-destroyer. But its inability to follow German fighters in a dive was rendering it increasingly ineffective as an escort fighter, precisely the role it needed to excel in. The problem landed on the desk of one of America's most brilliant aeronautical engineers, Kelly Johnson of Lockheed. Johnson had designed the P-38 and knew every inch of the aircraft intimately. When field reports about the compressibility issues reached him in late 1942, he immediately understood the physics involved. At high subsonic speeds, the P-38's relatively thick wing profile was creating powerful shock waves that rendered the elevator controls ineffective. Once a Lightning entered a steep dive and accelerated beyond a critical speed, recovery became impossible. Johnson and his team at Lockheed's Burbank facility attacked the problem with unprecedented urgency. Bomber losses were mounting, and the entire American daylight bombing strategy hung in the balance. Their solution was deceptively simple yet revolutionary: a small rectangular flap positioned on the lower surface of the wing, just forward of the main spar. When deployed in a high-speed dive, this dive recovery flap would disrupt the formation of shock waves, restore elevator effectiveness, and allow the pilot to pull out of the dive. The concept was tested in wind tunnels at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA facility, in early 1943, with promising results. But wind tunnel testing couldn't fully replicate the real-world conditions of combat. The true test would come in the skies over Europe, where German pilots had grown dangerously confident in their ability to escape the lightning. The first P-38s equipped with dive recovery flaps reached the European theater of operations in September 1943. They were assigned to the 55th Fighter Group, one of the pioneering P-38 units in the 8th Air Force. The new modification was kept deliberately low-key. There was no special announcement, no fanfare. German intelligence would not be alerted to the change. The American command wanted the Luftwaffe to learn about the modification the hard way, in combat. Hauptmann Werner Schröer of JG-27, with 114 victories to his credit by late 1943, was among the first to encounter the modified P-38s. On October 10, 1943, while defending a Messerschmitt factory near Wiener Neustadt, Schröer executed what should have been a textbook escape maneuver when confronted by a pair of lightnings. He rolled his Bf-109G inverted and pushed into a near-vertical dive, expecting to pull away rapidly. "I was completely shocked when I looked over my shoulder," Schröer later recalled in his combat report. "The lightning was not only staying with me in the dive, but was actually closing the distance. I pulled harder, diving steeper, certain that the American aircraft would lock up at any moment. It did not. When I saw tracer fire passing my cockpit, I knew something fundamental had changed in the air war." Schröer survived by executing a series of violent rolling maneuvers that the heavier P-38 couldn't match. But his squadron lost 3 pilots that day to lightnings that followed them through dives that German pilots had considered safe just weeks earlier. Word quickly spread through Luftwaffe units on the Western Front. The P-38's fatal weakness had been fixed. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound and immediate. The Luftwaffe had built an entire defensive doctrine around the Lightning's compressibility limitations. Pilot training had emphasized the diving escape as the primary survival tactic when encountering P-38s. Now, that sanctuary had vanished overnight. A German fighter pilot's calculation of survival had fundamentally changed. Oberleutnant Erich Rudorfer, a Luftwaffe ace with JG-2, who would survive the war with 222 victories, described the change in his post-war memoirs. "Before the Americans fixed the Lightning, we considered it dangerous but manageable. The P-51 Mustang received more attention because it could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin. But when the P-38 gained the ability to follow us in dives, it became the most feared American fighter. Its 4 machine guns and cannon, all concentrated in the nose, created a pattern of fire far more concentrated than wing-mounted weapons. A 1-second burst from a Lightning could tear a 109 or 190 apart." The improved P-38 arrived at a crucial moment in the air war. Throughout 1943, the 8th Air Force had been suffering catastrophic losses in its daylight bombing campaign against German industry. The October 14, 1943 raid on Schweinfurt had resulted in the loss of 60 B-17s, nearly a quarter of the attacking force. Without effective fighter escort, the American bombing campaign was proving unsustainable. The modified P-38, along with the arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang, helped turn the tide. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 479th Fighter Group, equipped with modified P-38s, reported in December 1943, "German fighters now actively avoid engaging our Lightnings when possible. They have clearly been instructed about the aircraft's new capabilities. When our groups enter an area, enemy fighters often withdraw rather than commit to combat. For Luftwaffe pilots, the implications were existential. Not only had they lost a reliable defense against one of America's primary fighters, but the change came at precisely the moment when German fighter strength was beginning to wane. Fuel shortages were limiting training time for new pilots, while experienced aces were being lost at an accelerating rate. The Luftwaffe was entering a downward spiral from which it would never recover. The story of the dive recovery flap's impact is perhaps best illustrated by the experience of Major Hans-Günther von Kornatzky, Gruppenkommandeur of Zantui JG-11. In January 1944, von Kornatzky led 16 Bf-109Gs to intercept American bombers near Frankfurt. When 8 P-38 Lightnings appeared above his formation, he ordered his pilots to split into pairs and dive away, a tactic that had worked reliably just months earlier. The results were devastating. The P-38 separated into elements and followed the diving German fighters. Of the 16 Messerschmitts that began the engagement, 7 were shot down, and 3 more were damaged severely enough to force emergency landings. Von Kornatzky himself barely escaped, his aircraft riddled with bullet holes from a pursuing Lightning that had followed him through a dive to 12,000 feet before he managed to escape into cloud cover. In his subsequent report to Luftwaffe High Command, von Kornatzky wrote words that would send shockwaves through German fighter units. The standard evasion tactic against P-38s can no longer be considered effective. The Americans have overcome the dive limitation. I strongly recommend immediate dissemination of this information to all fighter units and the urgent development of new defensive tactics. The Luftwaffe's response was hampered by its deteriorating position. Fuel shortages limited the flight time available to develop and practice new tactics. The loss of experienced flight leaders meant that many German fighter units were now led by pilots with minimal combat experience, and the relentless Allied bombing campaign was forcing the Luftwaffe to disperse its units across numerous smaller airfields, complicating command and control. Nevertheless, Luftwaffe tactics did evolve. Rather than attempting to escape P-38s through diving, German fighters began to exploit the Lightning's remaining weaknesses, particularly its roll rate. The P-38, with its large wingspan and twin-boom configuration, couldn't roll as quickly as the nimbler German fighters. Luftwaffe pilots developed tactics involving tight rolling scissors maneuvers that the Lightning struggled to follow. Major Egon Meyer, who commanded JG-2 Richthofen until his death in March 1944, issued new guidance to his pilots. When confronted by P-38s, do not dive. Instead, force them into a rolling fight. If outnumbered, dive only as a last resort and be prepared for the Lightning to follow. Use cloud cover whenever possible to break contact. For American P-38 pilots, the addition of dive recovery flaps transformed their combat experience. Lieutenant Richard E. Brown of the 55th Fighter Group described the change. Before the flaps, engaging 109s was an exercise in frustration. They would roll over and dive away, and there wasn't a damn thing we could do about it. With the dive recovery flaps, we could stay with them all the way down. The first time I followed a 109 in a dive and saw the pilot's shocked expression when he realized I was still on his tail at 15,000 feet, I knew the game had changed. The technological achievement represented by the dive recovery flap extended beyond its tactical impact. It demonstrated the American capacity for rapid technological adaptation in response to battlefield experience, a capacity that would prove decisive in the air war. While the Luftwaffe struggled with fuel shortages and manufacturing limitations that hindered aircraft development, American engineers were continually refining their aircraft based on combat feedback. Kelly Johnson, the engineer behind the dive recovery flap, would later reflect, the P-38's compressibility problem was the most challenging aerodynamic issue I faced during the war. The solution was deceptively simple, but finding it required understanding physics that were at the very edge of our knowledge at the time. We were dealing with transonic airflow patterns that wouldn't be fully understood until after the war. The modification of the P-38 Lightning with dive recovery flaps represented more than just a technical fix to an aerodynamic problem. It was a pivotal moment in the air war over Europe, the point at which German fighter pilots lost a critical tactical advantage they had relied upon for survival. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe morale was as significant as the tactical change itself. Feldwebel Walter Wolfram, who flew with JG-52 and survived the war with 137 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, was temporarily assigned to defense of the Reich duties in early 1944. His first encounter with the modified P-38s left a lasting impression. We had been briefed that the twin-boomed American fighter was to be feared for its firepower, but could be outmaneuvered and, if necessary, outdived. When I attempted to dive away from a formation of P-38s near Stuttgart, I was astounded to find them matching my dive angle. Only by entering clouds at about 7,000 meters was I able to escape. 3 of my comrades who tried the same maneuver without cloud cover did not return. For American bomber crews, the improvement in the P-38 came as a tremendous relief. The heavy losses of 1943 had been demoralizing, and many doubted the sustainability of the daylight bombing campaign. Staff Sergeant James Mahoney, a ball turret gunner on a B-17F with the 91st Bomb Group, recorded in his diary in February 1944, "Had our closest escort ever today from the P-38 boys. When the 109s came in, our Lightning escorts stayed right with them, even when the Germans tried their usual diving tricks. Saw 2 109s flaming on the way down. Morale on the return flight was the highest I've experienced." The operational impact of the dive recovery flap was most evident in the escort statistics for early 1944. In December 1943, before the modification was widespread, P-38 groups in the 8th Air Force claimed 102 German aircraft destroyed while losing 53 of their own, a kill ratio of just under 2.1. By March 1944, with the modified P-38s fully deployed, the same groups claimed 217 victories while losing 67 aircraft, improving the kill ratio to nearly 3.5.1. These numbers tell only part of the story, however. The true measure of fighter escort effectiveness was bomber survival, and here too the impact was clear. Bomber formations escorted by P-38 groups saw their loss rates decline from an average of 8.1% in late 1943 to 3.6% by spring 1944. While this improvement cannot be attributed solely to the dive recovery flap, better tactics and the increasing presence of P-51 Mustangs also contributed. Combat reports specifically noted the Lightning's new ability to pursue and engage German interceptors that previously would have escaped. The technical aspects of the dive recovery flap provide a fascinating glimpse into the state of aerodynamic knowledge in the mid-1940s. The phenomenon of compressibility was still poorly understood. As aircraft speeds increased beyond about 450 mph, airflow over portions of the wing would reach sonic velocity, even though the aircraft itself was still traveling at subsonic speed. This created shock waves that dramatically changed the airflow patterns around the control surfaces. For the P-38, with its thick wing section, this problem was particularly acute. As the aircraft accelerated in a dive, the airflow over the upper surface of the wing would reach sonic velocity, creating a shock wave that moved the center of lift rearward. This shift in lift created a powerful nose-down moment that the pilot could not overcome with elevator control. The faster the dive became, the worse the problem grew, often leading to structural failure as pilots desperately tried to pull out. Kelly Johnson's solution was elegant in its simplicity. The small rectangular flaps, when deployed, created a controlled area of turbulence that disrupted the formation of the shock wave on the lower surface of the wing. This disruption effectively rebalanced the aerodynamic forces, preventing the severe nose-down pitch and allowing the elevators to remain effective. Pilots could now recover from dives that previously would have been fatal. What makes this innovation particularly remarkable is that it was developed without a complete theoretical understanding of transonic aerodynamics. Johnson and his team were working at the boundaries of aerodynamic knowledge, using intuition and practical experimentation to solve problems that the existing scientific framework couldn't fully explain. The comprehensive mathematical models of transonic flow would not be developed until after the war. For Luftwaffe pilots, the psychological impact of this American innovation was devastating. German fighters had long held qualitative advantages over their Allied counterparts, allowing outnumbered Luftwaffe units to remain effective even as the numerical odds worsened. The loss of the diving escape advantage removed a critical element of this qualitative edge at precisely the moment when German air defenses were under maximum pressure. Oberleutnant Günther Rau, who would end the war as the third highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, described the change in his post-war interviews. By early 1944, we knew that the Americans had solved the P-38's diving problem. This fundamentally changed our approach to combat. Before we could engage on relatively favorable terms, knowing we always had an escape route. Afterward, every engagement became potentially fatal if we misjudged the situation or were outnumbered. The psychological pressure increased enormously. This pressure was exacerbated by the Luftwaffe's deteriorating position in the broader war. Fuel allocations for fighter units were being steadily reduced, limiting training flights for new pilots and restricting combat operations. Manufacturing disruptions due to bombing meant that aircraft maintenance became increasingly problematic, with spare parts in chronic shortage. And the relentless Allied advance meant that German units were frequently forced to relocate to new airfields, often with minimal notice. In this context, the loss of a reliable defensive tactic against one of the primary American fighters represented more than just a tactical setback. It was part of a compounding series of challenges that were overwhelming the German air defense system. For individual pilots already facing increasingly insurmountable odds, the removal of the diving escape sanctuary added a new dimension of vulnerability. Hauptmann Wilhelm Hoffmann of JG-1 Ossau captured this sense of vulnerability in his unit's operational history. By spring 1944, our newest pilots were arriving with less than 150 flight hours total, facing American pilots who often had twice that before they even left training. Our technological advantages were disappearing one by one. When the P-38s gained the ability to follow us in dives, it eliminated one of our few remaining tactical options. Each mission became a calculation of how to inflict damage on the bomber streams while preserving enough of our force to fight again tomorrow. For German civilian populations, the improved effectiveness of American escort fighters had immediate and devastating consequences. The P-38's new capabilities, combined with the increasing numbers of long-range P-51 Mustangs, meant that Allied bombers could now operate with effective fighter cover over virtually any target in the Reich. The result was an acceleration of the strategic bombing campaign that was systematically destroying German industrial capacity and infrastructure. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, noted in his diary on February 22, 1944, "The American daylight raids are becoming increasingly problematic. Their fighter escorts now remain with the bombers throughout the mission and have developed new tactical capabilities. Our fighter losses are reaching unsustainable levels, and the disruption to industrial production grows more severe with each raid. The Führer has demanded new countermeasures from the Luftwaffe, but solutions are not immediately apparent. Those countermeasures would prove elusive." The fundamental problem facing the Luftwaffe was that it was fighting a multi-front war against enemies with vastly superior industrial capacity and material resources. American factories were producing aircraft at a rate German industry could not hope to match, and the quality gap that had favored German designs early in the war was rapidly closing. Innovations like the P-38's dive recovery flap represented not just isolated technical improvements, but evidence of an accelerating technical evolution that the Luftwaffe could not keep pace with. As winter turned to spring in 1944, the full impact of the improved P-38 performance became increasingly apparent. Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, saw massive American daylight raids against German aircraft manufacturing facilities from February 20-25, 1944. The improved performance of escort fighters, including the modified P-38s, allowed American bombers to strike targets deep inside Germany with historically low loss rates. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland later wrote, "The week of February 20-25, 1944 represented a turning point in the air war. The Americans committed over 1,000 bombers and several hundred fighters daily to attacks on our aircraft industry. Our losses were catastrophic, not just in aircraft destroyed on the ground, but in irreplaceable pilots shot down while attempting to defend the factories. The Americans' technical improvements, including the P-38's new diving capability, meant that our fighters were engaged from the moment they took off until they landed or were shot down. The human dimension of this technological shift is perhaps best illustrated by the experience of Feldwebel Hans Dammers, a young pilot with JG-3, who encountered the modified P-38s in March 1944. In his last letter home before being shot down, he wrote, "The situation grows more difficult with each mission. The Americans have somehow improved their twin-boomed fighters. They can now follow us through maneuvers that should be impossible for such a large aircraft. Yesterday, Meyer and Schmidt failed to return after attempting to dive away from a group of these fighters. I do not know how much longer our luck will hold." Dammers would not survive the following week. His Bf-109G was found crashed near Hanover, shot down by a P-38J of the 20th Fighter Group. The Lightning had followed him through a desperate diving maneuver that, just months earlier, would have guaranteed his escape. His story was repeated hundreds of times across the breadth of the European air war, as German pilots discovered that their understanding of the P-38's limitations was fatally outdated. The operational impact of the dive recovery flap extended beyond direct combat encounters. Luftwaffe units were forced to develop entirely new interception strategies in response to the Lightning's improved capabilities. Where previously German controllers would vector fighters to approach American formations from above, setting up diving attacks that could be followed by safe escapes, now they increasingly directed their fighters to approach from below, avoiding situations where diving would be necessary. Major Walter Dahl, who commanded JG-3 Udet through much of 1944, issued a tactical directive that formalized this change. Attacks against bomber formations escorted by P-38 Lightnings should be conducted from below whenever possible. If Lightnings are encountered during attack runs, pilots should engage in horizontal evasive maneuvers rather than diving escapes. Diving should be considered a last resort and executed only when cloud cover is available below to mask escape. This fundamental shift in tactics carried significant costs for the Luftwaffe. Attacks from below exposed German fighters to defensive fire from the bombers' belly turrets and made them more visible to escort fighters. The approach took longer, giving American escorts more time to identify and intercept the attacking fighters. And climbing attacks consumed more fuel than diving approaches, reducing the time German fighters could remain in combat. For American P-38 pilots, the addition of dive recovery flaps transformed not just their combat tactics, but their confidence. Captain James Morris of the 370th Fighter Squadron, 359th Fighter Group, wrote in April 1944, "The improvement in the Lightning's handling is nothing short of miraculous. Before, we always had that moment of doubt when pursuing a 109 or 190 into a dive. Would the controls lock up? Would we be able to pull out? Now we can follow them down with complete confidence. Their faces when they look back and see us still there, closing the distance, that moment alone is worth everything we've endured in this war." The technical success of the dive recovery flap also illustrates a crucial difference in how the opposing air forces approached aircraft development. The Luftwaffe had recognized the P-38's compressibility problems early in the aircraft's combat career, but had viewed it as a fixed limitation rather than a solvable problem. German intelligence assessments from 1943 consistently cited the Lightning's diving limitations as a permanent characteristic that German tactics could exploit. In contrast, the American approach treated combat feedback as the starting point for continuous improvement. Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed viewed the P-38's diving problems not as inherent limitations to be lived with, but as engineering challenges to be overcome. This philosophy of iterative improvement based on operational experience would become a hallmark of American military aircraft development, continuing long after World War II ended. The story of the dive recovery flap also illuminates the accelerating pace of aeronautical advancement during the war years. In 1939, the cutting edge of fighter design was represented by aircraft like the Bf-109E and the Spitfire Mk1, aircraft with top speeds around 350 mph that rarely encountered compressibility effects. By 1944, fighters were routinely operating at speeds where transonic effects became critical factors in performance and survival. Engineers were solving problems that had barely been theoretical questions just a few years earlier. For the German pilots facing the improved P-38s, this rapid technological evolution was a stark reminder of America's industrial and engineering capacity. The Luftwaffe had entered the war with technically superior aircraft and highly trained pilots, but by 1944 that qualitative edge had largely vanished. America was not just outproducing Germany in raw numbers, it was now matching or exceeding German engineering solutions while maintaining its massive quantitative advantage. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who served as General der Jagdflieger, General of Fighters for the Luftwaffe, would later write, "By early 1944, we were facing not just a numerical crisis, but a qualitative one. American fighters had overcome their initial limitations. The P-38's diving capabilities, the P-47's high-altitude performance, the P-51's range, all had been dramatically improved. Meanwhile, our own development programs were increasingly hampered by material shortages and bombing disruptions. For the first time, we found ourselves at both a numerical and a technological disadvantage. The human cost of this shifting balance was paid by pilots on both sides, but particularly by the increasingly outmatched Luftwaffe. Experienced German aces who had survived years of combat found themselves facing odds that grew longer with each passing month. The loss of reliable escape tactics against one of the primary American fighters meant that each engagement carried greater risk, and the cumulative psychological toll was immense. Oberleutnant Franz Dürr, who survived the war with 128 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, was transferred to the Western Front in spring 1944. His memoirs capture the psychological adjustment required. On the Russian front, we maintained air superiority throughout my time there. Even outnumbered, we could dictate the terms of combat, engaging when conditions favored us and disengaging at will. In the West, facing the Americans, this control was gone. Their fighters, particularly the Lightnings that could now follow us anywhere, meant that every takeoff might be your last. The constant pressure affected even the most experienced pilots. For newer, less experienced German pilots, the situation was even more dire. By 1944, fuel shortages meant that new Luftwaffe pilots often reached operational units with less than 150 total flight hours, about half what their American counterparts received. Many had minimal training in combat tactics and almost no experience with emergency procedures. When these undertrained pilots encountered veteran American fighter groups flying technically improved aircraft, the results were predictably devastating. Luftwaffe records from the first half of 1944 tell a grim story. The average survival time for a new pilot assigned to a Jagdgeschwader on the Western Front dropped from 8 weeks in January to just over 3 weeks by June. Many pilots were lost on their first or second operational mission. The result was a death spiral for the Luftwaffe. Experienced pilots were being lost at an unsustainable rate, while their replacements arrived with insufficient training to survive long enough to gain experience. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, who commanded JG-54 Grünherz and later served as Inspector of Day Fighters, described the situation in stark terms in an April 1944 report. "We are now losing pilots faster than they can be replaced. Those replacements who do arrive lack the fundamental skills necessary for survival in combat against the Americans." The technical improvements to enemy aircraft, particularly the P-38's new diving capabilities, have eliminated tactical options that previously allowed our pilots to survive encounters with superior numbers. The current situation is not sustainable. The American side of the equation was markedly different. As P-38 groups gained experience with the improved aircraft, their tactical approach evolved from reactive defensive escorting to aggressive pursuit of German interceptors. The Lightning's twin-engine design gave pilots confidence operating deep over enemy territory, knowing they had a better chance of returning on a single engine if damaged. This confidence, combined with the new diving capabilities, allowed for increasingly aggressive tactics. Colonel Edward Chickering, who commanded the 55th Fighter Group through much of 1944, established a new tactical doctrine that emphasized the P-38's strengths. "We no longer wait for the Germans to attack our bombers. With our new capabilities, we hunt them from the moment they become airborne. The Lightning's diving performance now allows us to pursue them through any evasive maneuver. Our goal is not just to prevent attacks on the bombers, but to destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter force entirely." This shift from defensive to offensive escort tactics accelerated the Luftwaffe's decline. German fighter units found themselves under attack during assembly, climbing to altitude, and even during landing. The sanctuary of the diving escape having been eliminated, Luftwaffe pilots were forced to fight on increasingly unfavorable terms, often against overwhelming numbers. By summer 1944, the cumulative effect of these pressures was becoming catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. During the critical weeks following the D-Day landings in June, German fighters were virtually absent from the skies over Normandy. Luftflotte 3, responsible for air defense in Western Europe, could rarely assemble more than 100 serviceable fighters to counter Allied air operations involving thousands of aircraft. German pilots who did take off faced not just modified P-38s, but also increasingly numerous P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, all flown by experienced pilots with growing confidence. The technical significance of the dive recovery flap extended beyond its immediate tactical impact. It represented an important step in the understanding of transonic aerodynamics, the complex behavior of airflow as it approaches the speed of sound. The knowledge gained through the development and testing of this seemingly simple modification would prove valuable in the post-war era as aircraft designers pushed toward and beyond the sound barrier. Kelly Johnson, who led the P-38 improvement program, would go on to establish Lockheed's famous Skunk Works division and design revolutionary aircraft like the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, and later the U-2 and SR-71 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. The lessons learned addressing the P-38's compressibility issues directly influenced these later designs, particularly in understanding the critical importance of tailoring airfoil sections for high-speed flight. For the German pilots who faced the improved P-38s, however, these long-term technical implications were far less important than the immediate reality of their deteriorating tactical position. Oberstleutnant Joseph Pips Prayler, who commanded JG-26 Schlegeter through much of the war and finished with 101 victories, provided a candid assessment in his May 1944 monthly report. The enemy's technical improvements, combined with their numerical superiority, have created a situation where successful air defense is no longer possible with current resources. Our pilots fight with undiminished courage, But courage alone cannot overcome the realities of the current air war. Without a dramatic increase in aircraft production and fuel allocation, we cannot prevent the enemy from achieving complete air supremacy. Priller's assessment would prove prophetic. By late summer 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost the daylight air war over Germany. American bomber formations now operated with loss rates that, while still significant, were sustainable for an industrial power of the United States' capacity. German civilians increasingly saw only enemy aircraft in their skies, a visible symbol of the Reich's deteriorating military position. For the American strategic bombing campaign, the improved performance of escort fighters like the P-38 was transformative. Army Air Force's analysis showed that bomber loss rates on missions escorted by fighters equipped with the latest modifications were approximately one-third those of unescorted missions to similar targets. This reduction in losses allowed for sustained operations against crucial German industrial targets, particularly oil production facilities that were vital to the German war machine. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, explicitly recognized the importance of these technical improvements in his command strategy. Where previous doctrine had emphasized the primacy of the bomber and viewed fighters primarily as defensive escorts, Doolittle unleashed his fighters on offensive sweeps ahead of bomber formations with orders to engage and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it was found. In a directive issued to all fighter groups in February 1944, Doolittle wrote, "The development of reliable long-range fighter escorts with improved performance characteristics has created the opportunity to destroy the German fighter force in the air and on the ground. This is now your primary mission. Destruction of the enemy fighter force is a prerequisite for the successful bombing of German industry and will be given priority even over the immediate defense of bomber formations." This aggressive approach, enabled by technical improvements like the P-38's dive recovery flaps, accelerated the Luftwaffe's collapse throughout 1944. By autumn, German fighter strength had been so depleted that the Luftwaffe could no longer mount effective opposition to daylight bombing raids. The few experienced pilots who remained were increasingly conserved for critical operations, while new pilots with minimal training were sacrificed in desperate attempts to show some resistance to the Allied air offensive. The technical evolution represented by the P-38's dive recovery flap had contributed significantly to this collapse. What had begun as a simple engineering solution to a specific aerodynamic problem had cascaded into a fundamental shift in the tactical balance of the air war. German pilots had lost not just a reliable escape maneuver, but the psychological security that came with it, the knowledge that, if all else failed, they could still dive away to safety. Unteroffizier Kurt Schulze, a Bf 109 pilot with JG-53 who survived the war, described this psychological impact in post-war interviews. "Before the Americans improved their P-38s, we at least had certainty about escape. If you found yourself in a bad situation, outnumbered or out of position, you could always dive away steeply. It wasn't without risk, but it was reliable. When that certainty disappeared, everything changed. Every engagement became potentially fatal. The mental strain was enormous, knowing that there was nowhere to go if things went badly." For American P-38 pilots, the dive recovery flap transformed their combat experience equally dramatically. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Hubbard, who commanded the 20th Fighter Group's 79th Fighter Squadron, recalled, "The difference was night and day. Before the modification, we were constantly fighting the aircraft's limitations. You'd get a German fighter in your sights, start a diving pursuit, and then feel the controls stiffen as compressibility set in. You'd have to back off while the 109 or 1-90 pulled away. After the dive flaps were installed, we could stay with them all the way down. It completely changed our approach to combat. We became the hunters rather than the frustrated spectators." The engineering achievement represented by the dive recovery flap also highlighted the increasing American technical sophistication in aircraft design and modification. Early in the war, American aircraft had often been technically inferior to their German counterparts. The P-38, despite its impressive specifications, had initially suffered from numerous deficiencies when operating in the European theater. Not just compressibility issues, but also inadequate cockpit heating that left pilots suffering in the high-altitude cold, and engines that performed poorly in European atmospheric conditions. By 1944, however, most of these issues had been systematically addressed through a process of combat feedback, engineering analysis, and rapid implementation of solutions. The dive recovery flap was perhaps the most dramatic example, but it was part of a broader pattern of continuous improvement that characterized American aircraft development during the war. This iterative approach, backed by massive industrial capacity, allowed American designs to close the qualitative gap with German aircraft, while maintaining overwhelming numerical superiority. For the Luftwaffe, the elimination of the diving sanctuary against P-38s came at the worst possible moment strategically. The first half of 1944 saw the Allied strategic bombing campaign reach its peak intensity, with thousands of bombers striking targets throughout the Reich on an almost daily basis. Operation Argument, the Big Week of February 20-25, 1944, had specifically targeted German aircraft production facilities, reducing the flow of new fighters to frontline units at precisely the moment when losses were accelerating. Fuel shortages had become chronic by this stage of the war, severely limiting training for new pilots and restricting combat operations. Many Luftwaffe fighter units were operating at less than 50% of their authorized strength in both pilots and aircraft. And the imminent Allied invasion of France would soon create yet another front, requiring air defense resources that simply didn't exist. In this context, the loss of a reliable defensive tactic against one of the primary American escort fighters represented more than just a tactical setback. It was another step in a compounding strategic disaster for the Luftwaffe. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, once the proud commander of the world's most feared air force, was reduced to increasingly desperate exhortations as his fighters proved unable to stem the Allied air offensive. In a speech to Luftwaffe commanders in May 1944, Göring demanded, "You must find ways to engage these American escorts and destroy them before they reach our territory. I don't care what it costs in pilots or aircraft. The bombers must be stopped. The Reich cannot sustain this level of destruction." Yet the technical and numerical realities made such demands impossible to fulfill. The improved P-38s, along with increasing numbers of P-47s and P-51s, were now capable of meeting and defeating German fighters under almost any circumstances. The human dimension of this tactical shift is perhaps best illustrated by the experiences of the young replacement pilots entering Luftwaffe service in 1944. With training time severely curtailed due to fuel shortages, many arrived at frontline units with less than 150 total flying hours and almost no combat training. These novice pilots were now facing American fighters piloted by veterans with superior aircraft and the confidence to pursue aggressive tactics. Lieutenant Walter Schuck, who survived the war with 206 victories primarily on the Eastern Front, was temporarily assigned to defense of the Reich duties in early 1944. He later recalled the shocking difference. In Russia, even a new pilot had a chance to gain experience gradually. You might face combat, but you could choose your engagements to some extent. Against the Americans, with their improved fighters that could now follow us anywhere, the new pilots had no chance to learn. Many didn't survive their first or second mission. It was slaughter, not combat. The statistics bear out this grim assessment. In the first 6 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,000 fighter pilots killed or missing in action in the Western Theater, nearly half its total fighter pilot strength. Many were replacement pilots with minimal experience, but the losses also included irreplaceable veterans. By June 1944, when the Allies invaded Normandy, the Luftwaffe's fighter force was a shell of its former self, capable of only sporadic resistance to the Allied air armada. The P-38, with its dive recovery flaps, played a significant role in this destruction of the Luftwaffe's fighter force, particularly in the critical early months of 1944. While the P-51 Mustang would eventually become the dominant American escort fighter due to its longer range and lower manufacturing cost, the modified P-38 arrived at a crucial moment in the air war, when the outcome still hung in the balance. Colonel Ben Kelsey, a test pilot who had been involved with the P-38 program from its earliest stages and who tested the dive recovery flaps before they were deployed to combat units, later reflected, "The dive recovery flap represents one of those seemingly minor technical improvements that have outsized tactical impact. It didn't make the P-38 faster or more heavily armed, but it eliminated a critical vulnerability at precisely the moment when that vulnerability had become central to enemy tactics." The psychological impact on both sides was as important as the technical change itself. That psychological impact extended beyond the pilots directly involved in combat to the highest levels of command on both sides. For American leadership, the successful modification of the P-38 reinforced their growing confidence in the daylight strategic bombing campaign. What had seemed a dangerously costly strategy in 1943, with bomber loss rates sometimes exceeding 10% per mission, was becoming increasingly sustainable as escort effectiveness improved. General Carl Spaatz, who commanded U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, wrote to Army Air Forces Commander General Hap Arnold in April 1944, "The improvements to our fighter escorts, particularly the P-38's new diving capabilities, have fundamentally changed the equation. We can now sustain the bombing campaign at acceptable loss rates while simultaneously destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force." Complete air supremacy over Europe is now within reach, and with it, the ability to destroy Germany's capacity to wage war. For German leadership, the psychological impact was correspondingly negative. The Luftwaffe had been one of the cornerstones of Nazi Germany's military power, and its inability to defend Reich airspace represented not just a military failure, but a profound psychological blow to the regime's aura of invincibility. As American bombers ranged ever deeper into Germany with increasingly effective fighter escort, the myth of German technical superiority, a central tenet of Nazi propaganda, became impossible to maintain. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "The failure of the Luftwaffe to stop the Allied bombing campaign was perhaps the most visible symbol of our increasingly desperate military situation." When American bombers began appearing over Berlin in daylight with fighter escorts, the psychological impact on both leadership and civilian population was profound. For the first time, many began to seriously question whether the war could be won. The P-38's dive recovery flap thus represents more than just an interesting technical footnote to the air war. It serves as a case study in how seemingly minor technical improvements can have cascading tactical, strategic, and even psychological effects that far outweigh their apparent significance. By eliminating a critical vulnerability in an otherwise formidable fighter, American engineers changed not just the performance envelope of the aircraft, but the entire tactical calculus of the air war. For the German pilots who suddenly found themselves being pursued through dives that should have guaranteed their escape, this technical change was literally a matter of life and death. The reports of the first encounters with the modified P-38s spread rapidly through Luftwaffe fighter units, creating a sense of growing crisis as pilots realized that established tactics were no longer reliable. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war with 52 victories, recorded in his diary in March 1944, received disturbing reports today from the Seekhuis J.G. Want near Hamburg. 2 experienced pilots were shot down yesterday after attempting to dive away from P-38 Lightnings. According to the sole survivor, the American aircraft followed them through the dive without difficulty, something we have been told was impossible for the Lightning. If this report is accurate, we must immediately revise our defensive tactics against this aircraft. I have ordered all pilots in my staffel to avoid diving escapes if engaged by P-38s until we receive further clarification. Such tactical revisions came too late for many Luftwaffe pilots. By the time formal recognition of the P-38's improved capabilities had spread throughout German fighter units, dozens of pilots had already been lost, attempting to execute what had previously been a standard escape maneuver. The Luftwaffe's rigid command structure and increasingly disrupted communications meant that vital tactical intelligence often failed to reach frontline units in a timely manner. For American P-38 pilots, the dive recovery flap not only improved their combat effectiveness, but also significantly increased their chances of survival. Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey, a P-38 ace with the 20th Fighter Group, described the change. Before the dive flaps, pursuing a German fighter into a steep dive was essentially a suicide mission. You'd either have to break off the pursuit as compressibility set in, or risk losing control of the aircraft entirely. After the modification, we could follow them all the way down with confidence. It wasn't just that we could now shoot down more Germans, it was that we were no longer putting our lives at risk every time we tried to pursue one. The broader historical significance of the dive recovery flap lies in what it represents about the different approaches to technological development on opposite sides of the conflict. The American approach was characterized by pragmatic problem-solving, rapid feedback from operational units, and the industrial capacity to quickly implement solutions across entire aircraft fleets. When P-38 pilots reported compressibility problems in combat, the issue was treated as a technical challenge to be overcome, not an inherent limitation to be accepted. The German approach, particularly as the war progressed, was increasingly hampered by material shortages, industrial disruption, and a command structure that often prioritized production quantity over technical evolution. While German engineers continued to develop advanced aircraft designs, their ability to identify and address specific tactical limitations in existing aircraft was progressively compromised. Oberst Günther Lützow, inspector of fighters on the Western Front until 1944, noted this contrast in his final report before being relieved of command. The Americans continue to improve their aircraft based on combat experience, addressing specific weaknesses that our pilots have exploited. Meanwhile, our own improvement programs are increasingly delayed by material shortages and bombing damage to research facilities. We are falling behind not just in quantity, but in our ability to adapt to changing combat conditions. By summer 1944, the impact of the dive recovery flap had been largely superseded by broader strategic developments. The P-51 Mustang had become the primary American escort fighter due to its exceptional range and lower manufacturing cost, while the Luftwaffe's fighter force had been so depleted that tactical details of specific aircraft types were less relevant than the overwhelming numerical superiority Allied fighters now enjoyed. Nevertheless, for the critical months of early 1944, when the air war over Europe hung in the balance, the P-38's newfound ability to pursue German fighters through diving maneuvers played a significant role in tipping that balance decisively in favor of the Allies. For the German pilots who suddenly found themselves being followed through dives that should have guaranteed their escape, the dive recovery flap represented a terrifying demonstration that their understanding of combat was fatally outdated. The legacy of this seemingly simple modification extended far beyond World War II. The aerodynamic knowledge gained through addressing the P-38's compressibility issues contributed to the post-war development of supersonic aircraft. Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed, having solved the puzzle of transonic control during wartime necessity, would go on to design aircraft that routinely operated in speed regimes that pilots of the early 1940s could barely imagine. For the Luftwaffe pilots who faced the improved P-38s, however, such future developments held little relevance. Their concern was immediate survival in an air war that was turning relentlessly against them. As German fighter units withdrew ever further into the Reich, conceding air superiority over previously held territories, the psychological impact of innovations like the dive recovery flap compounded the material reality of dwindling resources and mounting losses. By the time Allied armies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to contest control of the air had been shattered. German fighters appeared only sporadically over the invasion beaches, and Allied fighter-bombers roamed almost unopposed over the French countryside. The air supremacy that made this possible had been achieved through a combination of industrial might, tactical evolution, and technical innovation, with improvements like the P-38's dive recovery flap playing a significant role in that process. For the young men who flew these aircraft on both sides, the war represented both terror and triumph, often in the same mission. American P-38 pilots, empowered by technical improvements that finally allowed their aircraft to perform to its full potential, pursued German fighters with growing confidence. Their German counterparts, increasingly outmatched both technically and numerically, fought with the desperate courage of those defending their homeland, while knowing the odds against them were becoming insurmountable. Lieutenant Richard Asbury of the 55th Fighter Group perhaps best captured the human dimension of this technological shift in a letter home in April 1944. "We're chasing them now in ways they never expected. Last week I followed a 109 from 25,000 feet all the way down to treetop level. You should have seen the pilot's face when he looked back expecting me to be gone, only to find me closing to firing range. These dive flaps have changed everything. We're no longer frustrated by watching them escape. Now we're the ones dictating the terms of combat, and you can see it in our results. Victory is no longer a question of if, only when." For the Luftwaffe pilot on the receiving end of Asbury's pursuit, that same technological shift represented the collapse of a tactical understanding that had previously offered at least the possibility of survival. The certainty that a diving escape would work had been replaced by the terrifying reality that nowhere was safe, not even the vertical dimension that had once provided sanctuary. In the final analysis, the story of the P-38's dive recovery flap represents more than just a technical footnote in the history of aerial warfare. It embodies the crucial interplay between technology, tactics, and psychology that characterizes modern combat. A small piece of metal, carefully positioned to disrupt airflow patterns that were barely understood at the time, changed not just the performance envelope of an aircraft, but the mental calculus of the pilots on both sides who flew and fought in the contested skies above Europe. For the German pilots who suddenly found themselves being pursued through maneuvers they had considered safe, this change came as a shocking revelation that their understanding of combat, and with it, their chances of survival, had been fundamentally altered. The terrifying reality they faced was not just that American fighters could now follow them anywhere, but that the technical evolution of warfare would continue to accelerate, rendering today's tactical certainties tomorrow's fatal miscalculations. In the unforgiving crucible of aerial combat, such miscalculations were paid for in lives. As the air war over Europe reached its climax in 1944, those payments increasingly came from the dwindling ranks of Luftwaffe pilots who found themselves confronting not just overwhelming numbers, but the elimination of tactical options they had relied upon for survival. The P-38's dive recovery flap, by closing one such option at a crucial moment in the conflict, played its part in the final defeat of the German Air Force and ultimately in the Allied victory in Europe.